Caitlin Rogers was a genius. That wasn't a fact she went out of her way to advertise, although it wasn't difficult to guess, looking at her as she sat alone in the college cafeteria, ignoring her plate of chicken fingers as she stared intently at her e-book reader, lost in her reading, the only motion around her that of her finger lightly pressing down on the next page button ever so often. She didn't attend college, of course, while there are some, and she usually wished she was one, very few 13-year-olds do, but she took a couple classes. She'd have preferred to take them all there, rather than at the high school she was actually enrolled in. She was pretty sure her high school would rather have it that way, too, since they didn't really know what to do with her, other than send her here, but they couldn't just pass her off so quickly, unfortunately for everyone involved. She giggled at her book, absent-mindedly reaching for her glass of soda and taking a sip, her eyes locked on the screen the whole while. She was used to eating alone, as she'd been doing it ever since her teachers had stopped forcing their classes to all sit together at lunchtime. She enjoyed it, usually, though it was better here than at her real school, like most things. Generally, nobody tried to bother her here, and if she got there at the right time, it was rather quiet. Every once in a while, however, some concerned, overly nosy individual would come over and ask if she was all right, if she was waiting on her big brother or sister. The first time it had happened, she'd thought it would be simplest to just say yes and leave it at that. That only led to more questions, unfortunately, like who exactly that might be. The concerned party was convinced that, with her honey-colored hair and sparkling green eyes, she was related to Ophelia, which was a name she didn't realize people were still using in the modern day. She'd been curious to meet someone named that, but the mysterious girl didn't show up before Kat's helper had to leave. Now she just told people no when they asked, and hoped they didn't require more of an explanation. And that was just what she was preparing to do as she felt the shadow of someone fall over her that day. She ignored it for the first few seconds, hoping they'd decide against pestering her and just walk away, then sighed and turned around when it was clear that wasn't happening. She was somewhat startled to see not one, but 3 people standing behind her. They were, as she would later be told, Ren, Robin, and Mina. Ren was the shortest, only slightly taller than Kat, and just a little round, a brunette with hair reaching down nearly her whole back. She was fairly shy and, as much as any of them could manage when they were almost always together, kept to herself. She was Caitlin's favorite. Robin was the tallest, with a patch of flaming red hair atop her head, short and spiky, a patch of freckles dotting her face, and she was anything but shy. Mina was between the other two in height. Her jet black hair fell between the others in length as well. Kat would later see that it reached just to her shoulders, though at the time, it was done up in a pair of tiny pigtails. She seemed to hang around the other two to watch what they did and laugh at them. Kat had never used the word before, choosing to refer to the girls who picked on her at her real school as idiots and children, sure they would grow out of it one day and feel bad for how they'd treated her and anyone else different from them, though Mina provided proof that not all of them would, but Mina was a bitch. The first thing, in fact, she said to Caitlin was, "I think you're lost, love," quickly followed, after Kat's bewildered look in response, with, "Grayson Elementary is a couple streets over." Robin smacked her on the arm, giving her a reproachful glare. "What she means to say," she corrected, "is how are you doing?" "I'm good." Kat glanced between the 3, currently strange, girls, trying to glean whether this whole thing was some sort of trick. "Great!" Robin exclaimed, beaming. "How long before your next class?" This bewildered Kat all the more. Did they know who she was? Did they just assume that, despite her youthful appearance, which at least one of them had clearly noticed, she was an actual student? Either way, the answer was, about half an hour. She had 2 classes at the college, straddling lunchtime, twice a week. The schedule had seemed silly to her at first, though that gave her enough time on campus that her mother could run an errand or 2, or whatever it was she did, between ferrying her from school to school. "Do you want to hang out with us?" It seemed an innocent enough question. Part of Kat wanted to just keep reading on her own regardless, but another was flattered that real college students actually wanted to spend time with her, and that, despite Mina's little joke, they seemed to be treating her as an equal, rather than a small child. At least until Mina chirped in with another little joke. Yeah, we could use some spare cash, so we decided to give babysitting a whirl. Just ignore her, Robin rolled her eyes. You can beat her up when we get to my room. Or just tape her mouth shut. Kat was still uncertain, glancing up at the clock in the cafeteria with an "I don't know." We won't let you miss your class, Ren spoke up finally. Don't worry. Only semi-reluctantly, she gave in. They didn't do much, just sat on Robin's bed and chatted, but she couldn't deny that it was nicer than sitting alone and reading, which she could do when she was at home. After that, she almost always found them in the cafeteria, waiting for her with an empty chair at their table, or just a few minutes behind her coming in. She became fast friends with them, or at least with Robin and Ren. Mina, for her part, learned to tell when she was feeling especially insecure, and usually went easy on her then, which was about as good as it got with her. Suddenly, the 3 days a week she spent at her real school during lunch felt rather lonely. When her birthday came around, near the end of the school year, and, as always, her mother asked her if she wanted to invite anyone to celebrate with them, for once she could say yes. She was a little reluctant to ask them. There was a difference between simply hanging out during lunch, since they were already there anyway, and asking them to go out of their way to come to her house, when she was sure they had better things to do than go to some kid's birthday dinner. It wasn't even a party, really, though her parents insisted on calling it that, even when it was just them and her. Well, we'll see, came the answer from Robin, glancing at the other two nervously. You don't have to. Kat had quickly told them, not wanting them to feel obligated, though she really would have liked it. Even expecting it, she couldn't deny it had hurt a little that they hadn't immediately said yes. It's just that we have finals coming up soon, you know. Robin sounded strangely uncertain. Kat was starting to resign herself to spending another birthday alone, and hoping she hadn't spooked them off entirely. Maybe they didn't see her as the kind of friend they did that sort of thing with. Yeah, some of us have more than 2 classes to study for, Mina butted in. I know, Caitlin said quietly. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. Of course we'll be there. Kat glanced over at Ren, still slightly surprised to hear her say anything, much less something so assertive. Ren was perched at the edge of Robin's desk chair, glaring at the other two. It won't kill us to take a night off. You're right, Robin conceded, turning to Kat. She's right. We'll be there. She smiled a little as Kat beamed, unable to hide her pleasure. Hey, could we get your mom's phone number so we can get directions to your house? Now that they'd accepted, she had a whole new batch on anxieties bubbling in her. Would they think her house, or her parents, were lame? She had no control over those things of course, but would they want to see her room, since she'd spent so much time in theirs? Would they think it was too kiddie? To try to avoid that, she started to hide her stuffed animals, taking down some of her older posters. Would her parents like them? She didn't know that she wanted them to like her friends too much, really, but enough that they didn't forbid her from hanging out with them. She started to regret inviting Mina, but how would she have asked the other two without her? It turned out she needn't have worried. She had been waiting in her room when they arrived, so her mother beat her to the door. She stopped her rush towards the door for a moment, suddenly shy about having to walk in and immediately introduce everyone, unsure whether she should call her mother Mom or Mother, not wanting to sound like she was trying too hard to sound mature, but not wanting to sound too immature either. Down the hall and around the corner, she heard, "Oh, hello, girls. So good to see you again." That gave her another pause, but she pretended she hadn't heard it, walking in and acting normally, though one of Mina's offhand jokes from that first day they'd met was haunting her. Had they really just been babysitting her all along? She couldn't really imagine her parents choosing them, of all people, but that would be what made them such a good choice. She couldn't help but wonder about that as they ate dinner. It was a nice change of pace from worrying how well her friends and her parents would get along, as she'd been expecting to do. And it would explain a lot, really, such as why they would have ever bothered to talk to her in the first place. She started to think about ways to find out for sure, and what she would do if it was true. She was broken out of her thoughts a few minutes after dinner, first by the presentation of her cake and the blowing out of the candles, and then by her mother clearing her throat and giving Robin a meaningful look. Robin spoke up, strangely shy for her. We have a present for you." Kat had already opened her presents that day, not wanting the girls to see, as she was unsure if she could trust her parents not to give her something silly and childish in front of them. She hadn't even thought about them giving her anything. She gave the customary, "You didn't have to do that," though she had to admit she was rather curious. No, it's our pleasure," Robin replied, completing the ritual. "Well, we can't really give it to you, 'cause it's not that kind of a present, but well, we're taking a road trip the week after classes end to go look at grad schools, and we wanted you to come with us." Kat looked up in surprise, her eyes darting from the girls, somewhat bashfully smiling at her, to her parents. "It's fine with us," her mother told her. "We've been talking about it for a week now, and I think it's a sweet idea." Kat quickly thought back, and it had been just a little over a week since she'd given out her mother's phone number. She had thought it a little strange that they hadn't just asked for her address so they could MapQuest it. Kat breezed through her finals, as did the other girls. She didn't see them as much, but whenever she did, she was searching for a crack in their armor, some sign that they were just pretending, that they didn't really want to take her along. But if they were at all reluctant, they hid it well, mixing complaints about what their teachers had put on their tests despite claiming they weren't going to, with telling Kat how much fun they were going to be having in just a few days, and how glad they had managed to talk her parents into it. They'd met her parents for coffee, they said, and had to all but submit to a background check before they finally agreed. It was all Ren, Robin claimed, and Kat didn't doubt it, not least of all because Robin would surely have taken credit for it if it had been her, and Mina would never have done anything to convince them she was capable of looking after anyone. Ren just shrugged, not feeling the need to elaborate. Kat had already started packing by then. Despite her worries that this had all been set up, she couldn't deny that she was excited about it. She managed to beg a couple new outfits out of her parents for the trip, getting what she thought looked like a very sophisticated skit and suit-coat combination for the official part of their visits to the schools, even though she knew they wouldn't really be looking at her just yet. She also spent several minutes debating with herself on what length of miniskirt to buy, trying to find one that she wouldn't have to fight too much with her mother over, that she'd be comfortable in, as she wasn't used to wearing anything like that, but that would still look more mature than her other clothes. Her mother didn't even question the one she settled on, making her worry she'd gone too conservative with her choice, but it would have been too suspicious to suddenly change her mind just because she'd gotten no other response at showing it off that, "Okay, sweetie." It wasn't like she had anything to show off yet anyway, though now that she was a real teenager, past that preliminary year, she was sure that would come along soon enough. She used her mother's old suitcase, a big yellow one with flowers that had been painted on years ago, and were now chipping off at the edges. She was glad she'd gotten her e-book reader for Christmas the year before, or else she'd have needed a second bag just for books. As it was, she only managed to fill her baggage up about halfway with clothes, though that left room for her pillow. Her mother told her that hotels generally had terrible pillows, and she was very particular about that sort of thing. Finally, it was the first day of the trip. Her mother woke her up early, got her started moving, then let her change into the old, holy pair of jeans and a t-shirt she'd helped paint the living room in a year or two ago, one of the outfits that had been chosen for the days they were just driving, while she fixed her breakfast. Kat wasn't usually a breakfast person, but her mother insisted on it, making her French toast with strawberries, bacon, and scrambled eggs with cheese, telling her it was hard to tell what the hotels would have for her in the mornings, apparently unable to hear that she didn't really care. Kat ate as much as she could manage, and then the girls were pulling into the driveway outside in the Tahoe Mina said she'd borrowed from her stepfather. Kat's father hauled her suitcase out for her, then returned to the porch with her mother. Kat gave them both a quick hug and a bye, then hurried out to the car, ready to go. Robin started the engine back up, but Wren reached up from the back seat, where she was sitting with Kat, and touched her shoulder. Robin seemed to understand, leaving the vehicle in park as Wren turned to Kat and said, "Go say goodbye." "I did," Kat protested. "Let's." "No." She didn't think she'd ever heard Wren interrupt somebody before. "Really say it." Kat stared at her for a second, then rolled her eyes, sighed, and got back out. Wren probably just thought she would feel more homesick if she didn't, which peeved her a bit, as she was usually the best of the three at treating her as an equal and not a little kid. But then, as they pulled away and Kat watched her house and parents get further and further away, realizing that, for the first time, it would be longer than just that evening before she saw them again, she couldn't deny that she was glad to have gotten her kisses, and to have told them she'd miss them, even if she had felt silly doing it while she was certain the girls were watching. She lasted perhaps 2 hours the first day before the movement of the car and the lack of rest from the night before, as she'd just been too excited, lured her to sleep. She woke up for just a moment in the middle of a storm, then fell asleep again. She rewoke slowly to an argument, a clear sky, and a curiosity as to just how long she'd been out. "There's bound to be some awesome bars there," Robin was saying. "It can't be that hard to find WH." "Morning," Wren said abruptly, marking the second time Kat had seen her interrupt. The other two fell silent as Kat stretched, looking around nervously. It felt odd, having been asleep around them, or really anyone not her family. She hoped she hadn't been snoring, or talking in her sleep, or anything else embarrassing. "So sorry we're so boring to you," Mina told her as she yawned again. When they'd first met, Kat would have been desperate to say that wasn't so, that she was just still a little drowsy, but by then she knew to just roll her eyes and ignore her. "Do you want to read?" Wren asked. "We're gonna stop in a little bit anyway, so we can get your book out for you if you want." "No, it's fine," Kat said. "We can just talk." "What were you guys talking about before?" Robin glanced over at Mina, then shrugged. "Nothing, really. We were trying to keep quiet so we wouldn't wake you up." "You didn't have to do that," Kat blushed. "I can sleep through most anything." "Good to know," Mina grinned. There was still a long ride ahead of them, and Kat nodded off a couple more times, though never for too long at a time. Road trips, she was discovering, were not always terribly interesting. But finally, they pulled into the parking lot of what looked like a group of teepees, which, she had to admit, was at least intriguing. Robin went inside to pay for a pair of them, and then they were off. Kat was a little surprised at how much stuff the girls had brought with them, wondering if she appeared woefully unprepared with her single suitcase, which she was working to wrestle into the room. It felt rather odd, being inside what basically amounted to a concrete cone, but she couldn't deny that it was different. She supposed that was why they'd chosen it. She was sure her parents would have just drove on by, but the girls had seemed all at once to decide on it when they'd first seen the sign for it. There was a small bathroom behind the main room that she gladly made use of while Wren, her roommate, started to unpack. Kat watched for a minute or two before finally asking, "Aren't we just leaving in the morning?" "It makes it feel like home," Wren explained. Kat thought about that for a moment. Isn't the point of a road trip to get away from home? Wren, of course, had the answer straight away. You can never leave it fully behind. It's better to just accept that. Kat unpacked a bit of her suitcase, but quickly got bored and decided it was good enough. "What are we going to do tonight?" Wren paused for a second, then shrugged. "It's hard to tell. I guess whatever Robin decides." Kat nodded, wondering, not for the first time, if Wren ever got tired of Robin making all the decisions. Wren was certainly capable of taking charge when she had to, but Kat assumed she just didn't like to, seeing as she rarely did. What they were going to do, it turned out, was go to a Chinese buffet first off. They'd driven through a McDonald's for lunch what felt like ages before, and Kat had eaten only a chicken sandwich, so she was feeling quite hungry. It felt a lot like being back at college, and she was having the good time she'd expected the whole trip to be like. She should have expected the driving part to be lame, she had to concede. It was what happened after that made it worth it, clearly. What now? Mina asked the inevitable once their bellies were all full. Kat had spotted a miniature golf course not too long before they'd reached the hotel, but she was a little afraid to suggest it. Was that something lame and silly that only kids did? She couldn't help but hope one of the others would suggest it, though. Instead, Robin said, "I was talking to the receptionist, and there's a semi-decent club not too far from here." It was clear from her tone that this was not a suggestion. Kat squirmed in her seat, wondering if, perhaps, Robin had forgotten about her. She didn't want to spoil the others' fun, but she wasn't sure what else to do, so she spoke up quietly with, I don't know that they'd let me into a club." Of course they wouldn't. Ren shot Robin a look, which was met and countered. "We could always go later," she suggested. "We can't go too late," Robin replied. "We need to get moving in the morning, don't we?" "I can go back to the hotel," Kat offered, happy to be able to provide such a simple solution, even if it wasn't one she wanted them to take. "Yeah, it's probably just about your bedtime anyway," Mina said. To her dismay, neither of the other girls said anything to contradict her, or even tried to change her mind. "You have our cell numbers if you need us," Ren said before they drove off, leaving her alone. She sat down on her bed with a sigh, holding out the remote control and flipping on the television. There weren't many shows she really liked, and, of course, none of them were on. She tried to read for a little while, but couldn't concentrate. Finally, she got back up from the bed and walked outside of her teepee. It was just starting to turn into nighttime, the air still warm, but starting to hint that it would be cooling down in an hour or two. She sighed and stared up into the sky, watching the first few stars twinkle. Another sort of twinkling caught her attention from the corner of her eye, and she turned to see fireflies dancing in the field behind the hotel. She giggled a little as she watched them, halfway tempted to go chase them, before reminding herself that she was on a road trip with a bunch of college students. She was way beyond doing something so silly. Instead, she went back inside and tried to watch the television again. Within an hour, she was asleep. She woke up still exhausted, her head aching, her mouth dry and her stomach empty and growling. She groaned, sure that she'd gotten sick on the first day of the trip, which was just going to make them regret bringing her along even more. As she sat up, however, she had something new to groan at, some strange, unfamiliar feeling around her waist. Confused, she pulled her covers away from herself, trying to remember when she'd covered up in the first place. She was no longer wearing her ratty jeans and t-shirt. She was in one of the nightshirts she'd brought along, but rather than the sleep shorts she'd brought to go with them, she was wearing a diaper. Her heart stopped for a moment as she saw it. What was going on? When had that happened? She heard Ren stirring in the bed beside her, and quickly pulled her covers back around her. She sat there like a statue for several minutes, then slowly got up, dragging her sheets with her, wrapped around her. There was just a little light coming in from the window, enough to show her that the digital clock that was sitting on the dresser at the foot of the beds was unplugged. She couldn't remember if it had been when she fell asleep or not. She saw the watch Ren always wore beside it, though, so she walked over and picked it up, surprised to see that it read 10:15 already. Weren't they supposed to have left 45 minutes ago? She turned the watch over in her hands idly, worrying that the other girls had left them behind for some reason, or that she was throwing the whole schedule off. Ren began to move again, and Kat quickly set it back down, biting her bottom lip nervously as she tried to decide whether she should sit back down quickly and pretend she hadn't been up, or try to grab some clothes and get changed in the bathroom in the hopes that Ren had nothing to do with her current outfit. She went with the former, diving back into bed and attempting to throw her covers out over her in a somewhat even manner. "You up?" Ren asked sleepily a few seconds later. Kat yawned. "Aha." Ren nodded, started to get up with a stretch. "Oh. Long night. Did you guys have fun?" she asked, blushing as she realized how accusatory she must sound. Ren blushed. "I'm sorry about that, Kat, it's just..." Kat shook her head. "No, it's fine. I know you guys don't want to spend every minute with me." Ren gave her a sympathetic look, walking over to her and putting her hand on Kat's knee, where it was sticking out from beneath the covers. Kat quickly withdrew her leg, now her turn to blush. Just then, Robin and Mina came bursting into the teepee, fully dressed. "What are you two doing in here?" Robin asked. Mina, on the other hand, was making a beeline for Kat. "You checked her yet?" she asked Ren, almost gleefully. Before Kat could let out even a squeak of protest, Mina had ripped her blankets away, revealing her diaper in its full glory, to the surprise of apparently nobody. "Wow, she actually looks dry." Kat was mortified. What are you?" "You were right, kitten," Mina said, giggling to herself. "You really can sleep through anything. We got back from the club last night, and you were soaking wet. We had to get you new sheets from the front desk, and make a run out to the store to get you some diapers so you wouldn't do it again. Really, you should have told us ahead of time you wet the bed, love. Did you really think you could keep it a secret?" Kat shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "I'm not," she protested. "Oh, I'm pretty sure we've got some pretty compelling evidence saying otherwise," Mina grinned, starting to pull out her phone. Kat gave out a sound like an injured animal, wanting nothing more than to drop dead right there. "Stop it." Robin smacked Mina's head, giving her a dirty look. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Mina rolled her eyes. "Lighten up. It was just a joke." "A joke." "That I have pictures," Mina clarified. "But you really did pee yourself like a 3-year-old. Go pack the van," Robin ordered her. Mina rolled her eyes, gave a mock salute, and left, not before pinching Kat's bright red cheeks. "Kat, really, it's not that big a deal." "Yes, it is," she wailed, starting to cry despite herself. "It really isn't," Ren insisted, putting her hand on Kat's shoulder. "We don't care, Kat, promise. We don't think of you any different." That made her cry all the harder. Did that mean they saw her as someone likely to wet the bed all along? Ren sighed and pulled her into a hug, sitting with her for a long while until the rumblings of her empty stomach grew too painful for her to ignore, and too loud for anyone else to. "Let's get you something to eat." "I'm not hungry," Kat lied. "Well, I am," Ren said. "Come on, why don't you get ready first?" Kat nodded reluctantly, grabbing up a random outfit and heading to the bathroom. She pulled the diaper off angrily, throwing it into the tiny trash can, which it nearly filled up on its own, then took a quick shower and got dressed. She stood in the bathroom for several minutes before getting up the courage to face Ren again. She saw Ren's suitcase sitting on her bed, neatly packed, and began to do the same with hers, throwing the few clothes she'd unpacked over the package of diapers that was now in there, until Ren came back out and they headed to the main teepee. Kat was a lot hungrier than she'd thought, feeling physically weak at just the short walk they were taking. She ate several of the tiny boxes of cereal the hotel had laying out, and a few pieces of toast with various kinds of jelly. Robin and Mina were busy talking about the route they were going to take, but Ren stayed silent with Kat, who was far too humiliated to even think of opening her mouth to do anything other than shove food into it. The sun seemed strangely high in the sky as they went back to their rooms to get their stuff, but Kat didn't think too much of it, as she was feeling rather disoriented as a whole. Things only got worse as Mina followed her into her room. "Is she in her diapers?" she asked Ren, as if Kat wasn't standing right there. "Don't be an ass, Mina," Ren shook her head. It's my parents' car, Mina said. And you never know when she's going to fall asleep. We can't have her peeing all over. I swear to God, Mina, Ren started, sounding more angry than Kat had ever heard her. It made her happy in a strange sort of way to know that it was over her, but she knew that Mina had a point. It's all right, she sighed. I understand. She opened her suitcase and took out one of the diapers, taking it into the bathroom. She came back out a few minutes later, the diaper still in her hands, looking quite lost. Honey, don't worry about it. Mina is just being a pain. Ren told her gently. No, I'm not. Do it for her, Ren. Ren shot her a dirty look, then shook her head. Fine. Take our stuff out to the car and we'll be there in a minute. She waited for Mina to leave, then had Kat lay down and pull down her jeans and panties, and quickly diapered her. Thanks, Kat said quietly. You were probably just sick, Ren said. I'm sure it was nothing. There's really no reason to be so embarrassed, Kat. Kat just shrugged. They reached the first grad school that afternoon. Kat had originally planned to go with them to tour the campus, but instead told them she wasn't feeling well, and stayed behind in the hotel. Ren offered to stay as well, but Kat knew she really wanted to see the school, so she let her go. Are you feeling any better? Ren asked when they got back early that evening. We're going to get some dinner, and then there's this neat old theater near here, and I called my dad, she said. He's going to be on his way tomorrow morning. Ren sighed. Kat, come on, don't be like this. We really don't care. Kat shook her head. I want to go home. They drove back the next day. She told them they didn't have to, but Robin said it was no trouble. They met up with her dad back at the TP Hotel, where they all spent the night, since none of them could get back to where they needed to be before dark anyway. It was around midnight when Kat woke up, glanced over at the bed Ren was supposed to be in, and found it empty. She tossed and turned for a few minutes, then finally got up and went outside. The Tahoe was gone, presumably still at whatever club had been so exciting a couple days before. She leaned against the door of the teepee with a sigh, her diaper crinkling beneath her nightshirt. Ren hadn't put her in it, of course. She told Kat over and over that she knew it was just a one-time thing, and that she didn't need them. And she had yet to actually use one of them. Even Mina had relented on forcing her to wear them in the car, since they'd all decided they didn't need to tell her father about it, or have him find out. They'd left the package of diapers in the trash can of the last hotel. Kat, however, had retrieved it, stuffing it into her suitcase beneath all her clothes. She hadn't unpacked it all that night, and been careful as she pulled out her nightclothes and pillow, making sure to keep the suitcase closed afterwards. She felt so stupid. This whole thing had been a stupid idea, she knew. She wasn't sure what she'd been trying to accomplish, exactly, or what she'd expected. But she should have known better than to try to spring all of this on her friends. She'd loved the idea of diapers for a long time, as long as she could remember. She always known it was strange, though, and knew she couldn't tell anybody. And then these three came along, people she could finally think of as her friends. If anyone would understand, they would, surely. But instead of just telling them, she had to try to trick them. And then the trick had worked too well. They were just so understanding, so kind, well, except for Mina, of course, and she knew she could never tell them it hadn't been real. But she couldn't keep pretending that it was real, either. I'm a terrible person, she told herself. Not only had she peed on the hotel's sheets and mattress, she'd made her friends clean her up, though she hadn't intended to be asleep for all of that, for them to notice what had happened right away like that, and immediately fix it for her. She'd even made Ren, the person she thought of as her closest friend, diaper her. She didn't know how to do it herself, true enough, as she hadn't actually worn before, but still. She could tell Ren had felt so bad about it, and there was no way she could tell her not to worry, that she liked it. Or she should have. She should have loved getting to wear diapers, and getting to wear them around her friends, and with their knowledge. That was what you were supposed to do with things you liked, wasn't it? Share them with your friends. She felt so confused. She knew she'd done something wrong, but she wasn't sure what. Was it the act of wanting to like the diapers in the first place? She knew she shouldn't, of course. She wasn't a little kid anymore, and she knew she shouldn't act like it. She even tried not to, but it just wouldn't work. After the next morning, she'd never talk to the girls again. They'd call her cell, but she wouldn't answer. She told her teachers and her parents that the college classes had been too much for her still, so she could take a year off from them, giving the girls time to graduate. She was soon in college herself, of course, and eventually found new friends, though she never dared to tell any of them about her interest. She threw the diapers away in the dumpster behind the main teepee that night, after changing back into her regular panties. They wouldn't be the last diapers she ever got, though they were the last for a while, and the last she didn't pay for herself. But before she did that, out in the dark in her nightshirt and diaper, she looked over at the field, and saw the fireflies, still dancing. She paused for a moment, and then she ran off after them, giggling. For a few minutes, it didn't matter if she was a kid trying to grow up too quickly, or someone too grown up, trying to ignore her responsibilities for a little while. If she had discovered how to capture that feeling like one of the fireflies she cupped gently between her hands, it would have been the most important lesson she could have learned, but, genius or not, that was something that would take her much longer to master. The Male Ballerina. Well, how long do you think you can pull this off? Mary asked her cousin Jack. Until after the recital, he replied. Jack and Mary had made a childish bet that he could not pose as a girl and get away with it during his summer-long visit to her home. When his aunt found out that they were playing dress-ups and he had planned to dress up every day, she decided to enroll them both in dance classes. Both Mary and Jack loved the idea. They were just weeks away from the recital and Jackie was selected for a key role. He smiled and winked at Mary, who was not very happy, for it was a role she had wanted. But being the good sport that she was, she went along with it and now looked forward to seeing him in his lovely costume of white tights, pink slippers, and pink and white top and tutu. Jackie could hardly wait either. In the meantime, both children practiced hard for the big day. Finally the big day arrived and Aunt Marge took both her nephew and her daughter to have their hair done at a local beauty shop. The beautician then showed them how to set the lovely tiara on Jackie's head that evening. Jackie's aunt helped him get into his costume and did his makeup. She watched as he carefully hid his boyhood between his legs, holding it in place with his panties. The costume helped that situation as well. When they entered the hall, there were a lot of oohs and ahs for the darling little girls, and especially for Jackie. He did not know it, but his own parents were in the audience, having returned from their European business trip a week earlier than planned. Aunt Marge had the job of explaining what was going on, and luckily Jack's parents had a good sense of humor and in fact were looking forward to seeing their little girl. Jackie was a huge success, and following the dance there was a small cast party, which included parents. When he saw his parents come in, they just smiled and curtsied. "We never realized that you were so talented," said his father. "I must admit that you do have a real talent, both as a dancer and as playing the role of a girl." "Dad. Please. These people still think I am a girl," whispered Jack. "Please don't give me away." "Sorry, son," his father whispered. "I just didn't think about it." His father smiled and winked at him. Well, I think you look lovely, dear, his mother added. Thanks, Mom. During the party, one of the dance instructors approached Jackie and his parents and announced there would be a special garden party for her students the following Saturday and asked if they could attend. Why, we would love to, exclaimed Jackie's mother. Since it is a formal garden party, we expect proper white party dresses for the girls and garden party dresses for mothers. Fathers should wear blazers and ties. That evening, Jackie asked his mother if she was serious about going to the party. Why, of course, dear. I would not miss it for the world. But Mom, I don't own that kind of dress. I've been borrowing Mary's clothes all summer. Well, then it is about time you get some things of your own. The next day, mother and a daughter went on a shopping spree. Don't you feel kinda funny about buying girls' clothes for your son? Asked Jack. Well, you don't look like my son in that pretty dress you are wearing, and I noticed that you even wear panties and a slip under it. Jack blushed and admitted that he really loved dressing and looking girlish. I could tell, his mother replied. I think we should go with the flow for now. Besides finding a proper white party dress, complete with full petticoats, his mother bought him several other play dresses, stockings and undies for his very own. I think it is about time you quit borrowing Mary's things. The garden party was the highlight of Jackie's visit. He was a real hit in his lovely lace-trimmed dress and matching gloves. Another first was his pantyhose, which caressed his legs and sent shivers all through him. His mother beamed with pride while his father maintained a sense of humor but wished it was all over. He felt uneasy seeing his son so comfortable in the role of a girl. The summer visit came to an end, but Jack, for the first time in months, except that he did wear his loveliest panties under his jeans. Back home, he thought about all of the wonderful times spent as a girl. Then one day he received a package of photographs from his aunt, along with the doll he slept with at their home and a nightgown exactly like the one he often borrowed from Mary. It had been his favorite. That night he went to bed early wearing his newest nightie, his favorite lace-trimmed panties, and snuggled up with his dolly. It was midnight when his mother entered his room to tuck him in. She smiled when she saw what he was wearing. The next morning, Jack woke up and found a play dress hanging on the hook outside his closet with a note for Jackie to come down to breakfast. He quickly donned a slip and the dress and arrived at the breakfast table with a happy grin on his face. This would be the way he would dress whenever his father was out of town. He was Daddy's boy and his mommy's little girl. Fooling around. I had left school having had just one caning, for fooling around on a bus, and one slippering, for loitering in the changing rooms after hockey, but I think the seeds of curiosity in corporal punishment had been sown. I had no idea how the next experience would come about, but I remembered those two experiences with shame and excitement. After I left school, I moved to a large town to work in an admin job which I enjoyed. I had managed to get some digs in a nice house owned by an elderly couple. They had explained when I responded to their card in the newsagent's window that they had decided to take a lodger not for the money but partly for the company and some help around the place. I said that was okay, and they pointed out that as the rent was low they really did expect me to help out with odd jobs like cleaning, shopping and so on. This interview took place in their front room and I had to stand on the rug while they addressed me. This reminded me of the interview with Miss E, my headmistress, when I transferred to a boarding school. They also had other rules and made it clear that I was not to bring boys in and there was to be no smoking or drinking there. I said I understood, and frankly this was no problem in exchange for such a cheap rent, which meant I could save some hard-earned cash. In a way, this was like an extension of school with rules being laid down but at this stage no penalty for breaking them. Being 18, I wanted to have a social life, and after a few weeks of being well behaved and doing their various tasks, I did skip a few chores. Both Mr. and Mrs. B did make comments to me, and I certainly got the message that they disapproved. They used phrases such as naughty and misbehavior, and I overheard Mrs. B talking to a visitor one day about deserving punishments and the other lady agreeing. Unfortunately, I did not get any more of their conversation. One evening Mr. and Mrs. B called me into the kitchen and told me to sit at the table. They said they had noticed that I had again skipped a few chores and that they expected them to be done in exchange for low rent, and they had made this clear when I answered their advert. Mr. B said that if I did not want the accommodation cheaply and to do the chores, then I should move out. I was quite taken aback, as I had not realized they were so offended by my shirking. Mrs. B then said that they felt that some form of punishment might be appropriate. I had no idea what she meant, maybe a small fine, but I meekly nodded at her suggestion. Mrs. B then said, "Just to be clear and to remind you, Mr. B and I think that some corporal punishment should be used. We do not think you are too old for a spanking, though other means are available if you prefer." It was funny, but I felt at ease with these two authoritarian pensioners and simply muttered something like, "Yes, yes." Mr. B continued, "Have you received corporal punishment, Jane?" I replied that I had been slippered once and somehow managed to reveal that I had been caned once too. Mr. B said, "Good, I am pleased that you have been caned." "Very well," said Mrs. B. "Come to the front room. I think we should start now." This was quite sudden, but you must remember that this was around 1967-8, when CP was common and young people generally did not argue with their elders. I followed her to the front room and she closed the door and sat on a chair. "Come over my lap, Jane," she said. I could hardly believe it but wanted to comply. I went over her knees, placing my hands on the floor. "We will start with a spanking and see how your behavior improves." With that, she started to spank my bottom. She must have given me 30 hard slaps and they stung. She told me to get up, and so I stood up and rubbed my bottom, and she reminded me of the couple of chores I had to do the next day. "Unless you want another tanning, Jane," she said. In the coming weeks, Mrs. B spanked me twice more and I began to enjoy her dominant manner. Then one evening the spankings stepped up a gear when I came home and Mr. B asked if I had posted his letter he gave me that morning. I blushed as I realized it was in my bag. He knew I had not posted it and pointed to the front room. In there I went over his knee, and believe me, he could spank hard. When he let me stand up I rubbed my stinging bottom. He then sent me to the post box and my bottom glowed and tingled all the way there and back. The spankings continued and I was enjoying them, and I wondered if they knew this. However, each spanking was for some genuine misdemeanor, and some but not all were deliberately let slip by me. After a couple of months, Mrs. B said that they were enjoying my company, but I was still slack with some chores, and over tea one day she asked me about the time I was caned. She listened attentively as I told her in some detail, and she said nothing more than to comment that she knew what it was like to be caned. That night in bed I wondered why she had asked, and I thought back to that event. I did fantasize that they would cane me, and when they were out on a couple of occasions I did look for a cane but did not find one, despite looking in their wardrobe, under the stairs cupboard and in Mrs. B.'s underwear drawer. On the following Saturday I called by with Roger, who I knew from a youth club in town. Bringing a boy home was definitely against the rules, but we would be there for just a few minutes while I went up to my room, but when I came down Roger had lit a cigarette. I ushered him out and used a towel to fan the room to get rid of the smell. We could not hang around as we had cinema tickets. When I came home that evening Mr. and Mrs. B were in the kitchen. I stood there while they quizzed me about smoking and I explained what had happened. Mrs. B said, "This cannot pass unpunished. You have had the cane, Jane." She knew full well that I had received 4 strokes, and when I said yes she acknowledged that she knew. Mr. B produced a cane from a hook on the kitchen door. It was a classic school cane and looked well used. "To the front room," said Mrs. B. I was aghast and excited but meekly led the way. They both came in and shut the door. I was also aroused, but now we were at the very point of receiving the cane again. I wondered if I could go through with it. In fact, I did not have any choice. "Turn round and bend over," said Mrs. B. I did so and paused for a moment, thinking of Miss E telling me to bend over just 3 or 4 years earlier. I bent forward and placed my hands on my shins, realizing that Mr. B was there. Mrs. B lifted my skirt and then took the cane from Mr. B. All I can say about the next few moments is that compared with Mrs. B's 6 of the best, Missy was tame. Each stroke bit my bum and was accompanied by a distinct swish and crack. I held my position, but when I stood up I could feel the welts beneath my pants. Mrs. B handed Mr. B the cane and I went to my room where the inevitable inspection was made. My bottom was marked more than when I had received those 4 strokes before, and the marks lasted for longer. From then on the spanking stopped, and it was always the cane. On several occasions Mr. B also caned me, and he always gave 6 and they hurt, but it was special receiving corporal punishment from him, as it was a no-nonsense approach. 6 strokes and then nothing more was said. After 3 years I was moving away, and on the last day I thanked Mr. and Mrs. B for letting me have a room at their house. "And the corporal punishment seems to have worked. My dear, you never forget chores now, do you?" said Mrs. B. I blushed, as I was more certain that she knew how I felt about being spanked and caned. "Well, you have spanked and caned me a number of times, Anne," I said to them. I wasn't sure what to say next. "I think you needed it, my dear," said Mrs. B. She did, said Mr. B. "But I doubt her next landlady will use the cane." It would be several years before a slipper, tawse, or cane marked my bottom again. Stealing grandmother's cookies. This happened one summer. I was on vacation at my grandparents' farm. It was a rainy day, so grandmother suggested that after lunch, we should bake cookies while my grandfather was in the barn feeding the animals. It was all great fun mixing up all the stuff that had to go into the cookie dough. While the cookies were baking in the oven, my grandmother told me to go and play with some of my toys. However, I was so fascinated with the baking process that I kept going back into the kitchen to look at the cookies through the oven door. My grandmother was not pleased. She lectured me for being in the kitchen without permission, and she sent me to watch TV in the living room with a sharp smack to my bottom. While watching TV, through the kitchen door I could see my grandmother take the cookies out of the oven. I was very excited that there would soon be freshly baked cookies to eat. I asked my grandmother if I could have one, but I was told firmly that they were too hot, and anyway we had to wait until my grandfather came in for his afternoon coffee to sample them. I wasn't best pleased with that, but went back to my TV. Eventually, my grandmother slipped out of the kitchen to do something else. I snuck back in there, took a spatula and tried to reach for a cookie. Of course, my grandmother caught me in the act. She told me off again and said I would have to wait. I tried telling her I was hungry. She replied that I could have some fruit, to which I replied in disgust, Grandmother was by now losing patience with me. She told me not to be rude, and I was put to sit in timeout in the living room, again accompanied by another sharp smack to my bottom. Grandmother told me that if she caught me near the cookies one more time, I would get a proper spanking. I'm sorry to say that during that timeout, I was not thinking about my behavior. I was only thinking about the cookies. When my punishment was over, I pretended to play with my toys, but when grandmother went out to see how my grandfather was doing, I went into the kitchen again and this time took a cookie. I was about to take my prize back to my bedroom, but my grandmother had seen me sneaking out of the kitchen, and noticed she was one cookie short. I heard her stern voice behind me. "Sarah, stop right there." I tried to hide the cookie behind a bag I was carrying, but my grandmother demanded to see my hands, and there was no escape. I held out both hands, and there was the cookie in one of them. "You are a very naughty girl," my grandmother told me. She took me by the arm and walked me to my bedroom. She sat down on my bed and looked me in the eye. "That's a very disobedient girl. Didn't I tell you would get a good spanking if you didn't leave those cookies alone?" She didn't wait for an answer. My grandmother put me firmly face down across her knee and began to spank my bottom. I got about 10 or so sharp smacks with her hand. The smacks on my bottom stung a great deal, and the punishment made me cry, as indeed it was intended to. Eventually, it was over. I was stood back on my feet and got a hug as I cried into my grandmother. She told me she still loved me, and that I could come out of my room when I had stopped crying and was ready to say sorry and behave myself. I finally emerged about 15 minutes later and said sorry like a good girl to both my grandmother and grandfather. They were both drinking coffee and eating a cookie, but because I was still being punished, I wasn't given one. However, after dinner my grandmother relented and I finally got to taste the cookies which had cost me such a well-smacked bottom.
The Guardian. A mother and her son are moving across the country, from Catterick to Cornwall. Their estate car is packed to the brim with boxes and cases, the roof rack too. As the mother is strapping the last few things to the roof rack, the new tenants of their home arrive and they chat. Mum introduces herself as Maggie and amongst the small talk, tells them that she lost the boy's father in Helmand 6 months ago, hence the move. The boy appears at the open front door, holding a vacuum cleaner. "Maggie," he hollers. "I finished the hoovering, does this need to go in the car?" he asked. "No, that belongs to the house, Peter," his mother replied. "He uses your first name, how modern," the woman says. "I'm his stepmother," Maggie replied. "Peter's mother left when he was 5 and I met his father when he was 6. "Oh, I see," the woman says. "And how old is he now?" 11. "So for all intents and purposes, you are his mother." "I like to think so." Maggie smiled. "He doesn't remember his real mum and I'm all he has now." "Oh bless him, it can be easy losing his father at his age." "No, but he's tough. Like his dad, a real trooper." Maggie smiled. "Here he comes," the woman said as Peter exited the house. Maggie's phone rings. "I've got to take this, excuse me," Maggie says, wandering down the drive, out of earshot and answering the phone. "You must be Peter," the woman smiles when the boy exits the house and approaches the car. They chat whilst his stepmom is clearly having a heated conversation. "So you're moving to Cornwall, I understand." "Yes," Peter replied. "Maggie's going to teach me to surf, it's gonna be really cool." "So it's Bude you're moving to?" "Just outside Stratton," Peter replied. "Oh, I don't know it, but I do know that Bude is excellent for surfing, you'll have a lot of fun there." "Yeah," Peter replied, glancing at Maggie who seems frustrated on the phone. "It's a long drive from Catterick." "I know, we're stopping at my aunt's in Chedworth for the night then continuing to Cornwall tomorrow." "Chedworth rings a bell, where's that?" In the Cotswolds. Lovely. Yeah, but my aunt's really bossy. I don't like her much. Peter replied. But she's my dad's only sister and I know she wants to see me. Yes. I'm sure she does, the new tenant replied. Your mum told me about your father. I'm sorry. That's okay. Peter replied. She's my stepmom. Peter stated. That's why I call her Maggie and not Mum, but she is my mum really. Yes, she said, the new tenant replied as Maggie returned, having hung up. Is everything okay? Oh, I hope so. Maggie replied. Peter asked who she was talking to. Your aunt, she sighed. Maggie shows the new tenants around the house, checking that everything is clean and that they haven't forgotten anything. She tells them about the local area, the town, the school and the neighbors and wishes them all the best. They seem nice, she said to Peter as they drove away from their old life, embarking on their new one. What was Aunt Sarah saying? All sort of things. Maggie sighed. But nothing to worry about, she assured. I just need to pop into Catterick before we head off, she told him. He waited in the car whilst Maggie was in the solicitor's. For almost half an hour he waited. You were ages, he moaned. Yes, I'm sorry. Something's wrong. Nothing that can't be fixed, she smiled, clutching his hand. His stepmother was clearly very stressed as they drove from Yorkshire, down through the Midlands, past Nottingham, Leicester and Coventry and through miles and miles of open rolling countryside and into the picturesque Cotswold Hills. They arrive at their destination, a large detached house. Aunt Sarah is on the doorstep as the car slowly crunches over the gravel driveway. Hello, Aunt Sarah. Peter says, giving her a hesitant hug. His aunt sends him inside where the housekeeper has sandwiches prepared for their arrival. Maggie and Sarah have a stern exchange outside, before both enter the house. Both pretend that everything is normal for a while, but Peter knows that something is wrong. After they've eaten and drank some tea, Maggie says that she and Peter should have a stroll around the garden. What were you and her arguing about? Peter asked when they were outside and out of earshot. Maggie doesn't reply until their Saturday. You know that your father and I weren't married, she states. Yes, but you're still my mum, he replied. I know, but in the eyes of the law, it's not quite so simple. Maggie sighed. I know I should have told you before now, but ever since your father died, your aunt has been trying to apply for custody of you. Why? Peter retorted. She doesn't even like me. She loves you very much in her own way, and she is your closest blood relative. Maggie replied. Was it her on the phone this morning? He asked. When you were arguing? Yes. Maggie told him. That's why I had to go the solicitors, she said. I'm sorry, Peter, but she won. Maggie hung her head. You have to stay here. But why? He whined. I don't want to stay here. She's your legal guardian now. Maggie told him. I'll do everything I can to get you back, but, according to my solicitor, I've done everything I can do and the decision has been made. Maggie doesn't stay the night as arranged, but she does have all of Peter's things packed up in the car, which will need to be unloaded. He has everything he needs and anything he hasn't got I'll provide. Aunt Sarah sternly states. A fresh start is best for the boy, not his old toys, and certainly not that mountain bike thing, she says, glaring at his bike strapped to the roof rack. They share a tearful goodbye. Maggie promises she'll come and visit in a few months. Peter asks his aunt if he can go to stay with Maggie in Cornwall, in the summer maybe. You can teach me to surf like you promised, he enthused. Surf? Aunt Sarah exclaimed. In the sea, she sighed. That's far too dangerous. The boy's much better off here where he'll be safe and cared for, she spat. I'm perfectly capable of caring for him, Sarah. I've been his mother for 5 years. You've barely been a stepmother. Aunt Sarah retorted. Since Robert never actually married you, she sniped. Why you think you'll be better off with such a vindictive woman like you, I'll never know. Maggie growled. Because he's my blood. You're just some floozy his father picked up. I'd better leave before I do something you'll regret, Sarah. Maggie snarled. And with that, the boy and his stepmother were parted. 8 months later, Maggie has finally been allowed to visit. What have you done to him? Maggie gasped. Surely you've heard of petticoating. Sarah replied, before prompting the boy to put his doll down and say hello. He appeared almost brainwashed as he did as asked, carefully putting the doll down in a seated position, before curtsying and saying hello Maggie. That's not how we address grown-ups, Peter. Aunt Sarah sternly told him. Say hello properly. Hello Miss Slater. Peter said, curtsying once more. Why is he dressed like that? Maggie exclaimed. Sarah reiterated that he's been petticoated, and this is how petticoated boys dress. But he's not even wearing a dress. Maggie gasped. Not whilst he's playing, it would only get creased, so he takes it off first, don't you Peter? Yes Auntie, he gulped. Do you need to see Nanny about your nappy? No Auntie. Are you sure? Yes Auntie. Well, put your dress back on. Playtime's over for today. Yes Auntie. Maggie and Sarah returned downstairs. Why on earth is he wearing a nappy? Because he misbehaved yesterday. He's 11 years old. Almost 12. Maggie remarked. Making him wear a nappy at his age is cruel. It's the rule. Sarah replied. Nothing helps a boy reflect on his behavior more than stewing in his juices, she stated, adding, would you rather I spanked him? Of course not. Maggie exclaimed. But making him dress like a girl must be humiliating enough, let alone treating him like a baby. Only when he acts like one and misbehaves. I'm going to speak to social services about this. By all means. I'm acting well within the law. Hundreds of case studies have been done which prove that petticoating is both a proactive and harmless form of discipline for adolescent boys. He acts like you've brainwashed him. Maggie retorted. He's merely learned some manners that he didn't have when you brought him to me. You took him from me. Maggie spat. His father would be beside himself if he was here. His father isn't here. The boy is being raised as I, his legal guardian, sees fit. And what about school? Maggie asked. He doesn't dress like that at school, does he? I felt it best to have him homeschooled. Sarah informed her. A governess comes every day during term time, you needn't worry about his education. I'm worried about everything. Maggie replied. What you're doing is inhumane, she stated. Now I understand why you wouldn't let me visit, she said as the sound of footsteps drew her attention. Click. Clack. Click. Clack. Click. Clack. The slow, regular sound of a solid heel on a hardwood floor seemed to go on for an age before the boy appeared in the doorway. His bright yellow dress is trimmed with white lace and looked humiliatingly short. Peter looked mortified to be wearing such an infantile outfit. In his hair is a big bright yellow bow and his lips are painted in a bright pinky red. Maggie gulps as her eyes drop to his feet, black patent Mary Jane shoes and a pair of lace-trimmed ankle socks. He stands absolutely to attention, with his hands behind his back, and Maggie can tell that he's not in the least bit happy here. Well, don't just stand there, Peter, say hello then you may sit. Sarah instructed. The boy gulped and dropped a curtsy, lifting his dress a little to reveal a glimpse of his frilly overknickers. Hello Miss Slater, Auntie, he meekly said, before perching himself not on a chair, but a small stool. I'll leave you to chat. Sarah said. If you need anything. Just call. Sarah said. Oh Peter. Maggie said, sounding on the verge of tears. What's she doing to you? Auntie says it's for the best. Peter timidly replied. I'm okay really. Wouldn't you rather be with me in Cornwall? Of course I would, Maggie, but I can't. Maggie glanced to the open door. Come on. I can take you away from this right now. We can jump in the car and we'll drive off. She won't have time to stop us. Maggie said, holding out her hand. I'll get you some new clothes. Boys' clothes, and won't have to dress like that ever again. No, Maggie. I can't. You can. We can. This is what she wants. Peter replied. You to come and take me away. I don't think so. She does, that's why I'm in trouble, for eavesdropping, he told her. She wants you to abduct me, then she'll call the police and we'll get caught and I'll be brought back here and you'll be arrested, he claimed. That's the only reason she let you visit me. But you can't stay here, not like this. Maggie said, knowing in her heart that his every word is true. I don't have a choice. Peter replied. When I'm 16 I'll be able to leave, then I'll come, then you can teach me to surf, he said. But that's 5 years, Peter, 5 years of living like a, she paused, unable to find a suitable word. Little girl. Peter said. Worse than that if she's making you wear nappies. Only when I'm naughty, he replied. I've learned to behave myself now, he gulped. It's like she's broken you, Peter, if there's anything I can do. Maggie said. Peter shook his head and stared at his hairless knees. Then he looked into her loving eyes. I'll come one day. When the law's on my side, he told her. Will you wait? I'll always be waiting for you, Peter. I know, he smiled. Peter stood and brushed his hands down his frock. I think about you every day, Maggie. And me, you too. Maggie gushed, taking the boy in her arms and hugging the air out of him, before coughing on his perfume, which he appeared to be doused in. How are you two getting on? The boy's aunt asked as she interrupted their embrace. Maggie glared at her. Maybe Peter can show you around the garden, she suggested. That's okay, Auntie. Miss Slater was about to leave anyway, he said. Weren't you? Yes. It's a long drive back to Cornwall. Well, you need some fresh air, young man, and make sure you play where we can see you. Yes, Auntie. Peter replied, before turning to Maggie, dropping a curtsy and bidding farewell to Miss Slater. His heels clicked and clacked on the flooring, all the way down the corridor. So I trust you're contented with what you've seen? Sarah asked. That he's happy and healthy and well looked after. He may be healthy but he's certainly not happy. Maggie scowled. The poor boy. You're robbing him of his formative years, making him live like this. You're doing nothing but humiliating him. Humiliation makes for a humble soul. Sarah replied. He's come on leaps and bounds from that boisterous brat you brought to me, she said. Now, unless there's anything else. Sarah gestured toward the door. Maggie clutched her handbag and made her way through it, down the long corridor towards the front of the house. The sound of gravel crunching in quick repetition filled her ears as she exited, and there on the drive is Peter, playing with a skipping rope. The bow on his head bounces like a butterfly and his short yellow frock reveals his bulbous frilly over knickers with each and every skip. Maggie gulps and gets in the car. She looks at her stepson one last time before reversing onto the street. She stops and sobs until all her tears are dry. Summer Day Sands. Mum took my sister and I for a day out at the seaside, and being a typical girl, my sister couldn't decide whether to wear her pedal pushers and a t-shirt, a sundress, or her playsuit. I, on the other hand, wasn't bothered. I had my cargo shorts and my sporty sandals, which meant I could paddle in the rock pools and play on the rocks. Right, Sarah? Mum snapped, clearly getting impatient with her indecision. Just put your sandals on, and put either your sundress or your playsuit in your bag in case you change your mind, and get in the car, please. Torn between 3 outfits, one of which she was wearing, Sarah seemed strained to decide. She screwed her face up, asked if she could bring both, was told no, screwed her face up again and left her favorite sundress behind in favor of her favorite playsuit. Why girls describe so many different clothes as their favorite, I'll never know. I have a favorite t-shirt and a favorite pair of trainers, and that's it. Sarah has her favorite pink top, her favorite blue top, her favorite this top and that top, and that's just her tops. Wait till she starts talking about skirts, dresses, pants. When we arrived, the tide was miles out from the shore and the craggy rocks and the sands were open for our exploration. Sarah and I ran around the marshes that sat just above the high tide mark. This flat expanse of grass was scarred with a myriad of shallow pools which were great fun to leap over but not to paddle in, being stagnant and seemingly lifeless. Being a boy, I was always keen to show off by trying to prove that I could jump further and better than my sister, and being my sister, Sarah was always setting me challenges. Be careful, you two, our mother hollered as ran across the marsh, jumping the pools and enjoying the freedom of the seaside. We took it in turns leading the way, and much to my displeasure, Sarah managed to leap even the widest pools. When it was her turn to lead the way, I was confident that I'd be able to keep up because she is, after all, just a girl. But my confidence was soon dissipated as she managed to leap across a pool that I felt was far too wide for me. Come on, Peter, Sarah said. If I can do it, surely you can. She did have a point, so I took a good run up and leapt as far as I possibly could. For a nanosecond I thought I was going to make it. Time seemed to slow to a snail's pace as I flew through the air, stuck out my foot ready to land on the marshy bank of the boggy pool, only for the tips of my toes to miss the edge by only a few millimeters. No sooner had I realized I'd failed, time sped up to its normal speed and I crashed into the water, and feeling myself falling backwards, I splashed and thrashed frantically to pull myself out. According to everyone, these pools are all full of quicksand, meaning the chance of escape would be almost zero. I quickly realized that wasn't the case as I found myself sat on my rear in about a foot of murky muddy water. Defeated, I got myself on my feet and dragged my sodden self onto dry land. Peter, I told you to be careful, my mother hollered from the track she followed. How on earth didn't you make it? Sarah said once she'd stopped laughing at me. It's not that wide. I think my foot slipped, I replied as the muddy water drained from my clothes. I looked down to see my legs and shorts covered in mud, and rather smelly mud at that. I slopped my way back to my mother, who just shook her head, frowning with that "I told you so" expression. "Oh Peter, look at you," she said as she turned me around. "You're completely covered in mud." "I'm sorry." I frowned. "Well, I don't know what we're going to do." Mum said, "You've nothing to change into and I don't want to waste a nice day out taking you all the way home to change," she told me. "He can wear my playsuit," Sarah suggested. Mum looked at me and frowned, then at Sarah. "I suppose he'll have to." Mum sighed. "Come on." Not keen on wearing anything that belongs to my sister, I suggested that I'd dry off in no time. But Mum said that the stinky mud was her main concern. I pointed out that there's nowhere for me to change, but Mum had already thought of that. "There's enough privacy down by those rocks, and you can wash the mud off in a rock pool." Reluctantly, I stripped down to my underpants and, seeing the back of my shorts and sweatshirt, realized just how much of a mess I was in. The sticky, stinky mud was caked all over the back of my clothing, and even in the rock pool it was reluctant to come off. Thankfully, my sister averted her eyes when my mother told me that my underpants would need wringing out. They may not be muddy, but they are sodden. Having wrung them out as best I could, I pulled the damp underpants back on and reluctantly stepped into the playsuit. "Do I have to wear this?" I moaned. Well, it's this or nothing, Mum replied. Think yourself lucky your sister didn't bring a dress instead. Its blue flowery fabric was the least of my worries, as the top half was held up by two thin straps that tied in bows on the tops of my shoulders. My sister giggled as Mum tied them for me. I thrust out my lower lip to make my disapproval clear. At least it's clean and dry, Mum said, before suggesting I get as much of the mud off my own clothes as possible, before wringing as much water out as possible before laying them to dry on the rocks. Sarah very kindly helped, and once done, suggested we climb on the rocks and paddle in the pools. Being dressed in a girly outfit, I wasn't keen on doing anything of the sort. I will when my clothes are dry, I said. Peter, they won't be dry for hours yet. It's pointless sitting around and moping when you've got almost the whole beach to yourselves, Mum told me. Reluctantly, I followed my sister but felt like a complete Wally. The only things that were good about her playsuit was the fact it was an all-in-one pair of shorts and a top, and not a dress, and that it was mostly blue and not pink, but other than that it was as girly as any item of girls' clothing could be. It wouldn't be so bad if the shorts were knee-length like most boys' shorts tend to be. These were short and had a frilly hem. My only hope, should we meet someone else, is that I'm mistaken for a girl and not a boy wearing a girl's playsuit. We found crabs and sea snails, even a starfish in the many rock pools we explored. We scaled a rock face in the hope of finding abandoned treasure, or at least some interesting bits of flotsam from a passing ship. We found an abandoned fire pit under an overhang which we decided had been used by smugglers or possibly pirates. We found a secret path which led us over and around the rocky outcrop by which our mother sat reading. We tried and failed to sneak up on her, but stealth was never one of my strong points. We ate egg and cress sandwiches, crisps, and guzzled fizzy pop. Mum told me that my clothes still weren't dry, but I wasn't that bothered. Wearing my sister's playsuit wasn't that bad, I admitted. Mum said I looked nice. Sarah said I could keep her playsuit providing Mum bought her a new one. Just because I don't mind wearing it now doesn't mean I want to keep it. I gulped. Anyway, my own clothes will be dry soon, I added as I grabbed the sleeve of my sweatshirt to find it still very damp. Why don't you two build a sandcastle before the tide comes in? Mum suggested. She always came up with something when she got the slightest inclination that we'd start bickering. Sarah and I clambered down the rocks and onto the sand. We improvised spades with a couple of pieces of driftwood and excavated a moat, the contents of which became a large mound. From this we formed walls and turrets and a series of streets inside the castle's walls that would eventually flood. I improvised a flag made from a crisp packet and a stick and mounted it in pride of place on the sandcastle's highest turret. By the time we'd finished, the patchy cloud had dissipated and the summer sun shone down on us. Mum called us over, so we clambered back up the rocks. That's a lot bigger than the last one you built, Mum said as we approached. Sarah told her we'd made streets and tunnels. I told her I'd made turrets and the flag. Mum told us we needed some suntan lotion otherwise we'd burn. Normally it was only applied to my arms and calves unless I was swimming. It seemed strange having to drop the thin straps that held the top of my playsuit up so Mum could apply the sun cream to my back and shoulders. I wish I could wear my playsuit now it's warm, Sarah moaned as Mum put my straps back in position. Well, hopefully this sun will dry out Peter's clothes before long, Mum replied. They'll still stink of mud though, I added. Yes, they probably will. Mum smiled. Your turn, Sarah, she said as she squirted a dollop of lotion into the palm of her hand. Sarah and I swapped places. I looked down at myself and tried to deduce whether I looked okay or ridiculous in my sister's playsuit, then I looked at Sarah as I sensed her staring at me. Wouldn't you rather wear my shorts and t-shirt than my playsuit, Peter? She asked. I considered it for a nanosecond. Although the style of her shorts and t-shirt may be a bit more boyish than her playsuit is, the colors certainly weren't. Her white pedal pushers had turn-ups just below the knees which reveal a pink lining, And her pale pink t-shirt features a big white flower on the front and has a ruffle trim around the short pin-tucked sleeves. No thanks, I replied. At least this is blue. Oh, Sarah moaned. I wish I'd brought my sundress now, then you'd have worn my shorts. Since she'd spent so much time deliberating before we left, I had a clear image of the sundress in my memory banks. It was short, frilly and flouncy, in baby blue with pink butterflies all over its light airy fabric and trimmed with white lace. I probably would have. I gulped as I imagined wearing it. Well, I think you'd have looked just as nice in her dress as you do in her play suit. Mum teased. I wish I'd let you bring both now, she said to Sarah. Me too, Sarah replied. Then I could have worn my play suit and Peter could have worn my dress, she said in her typical bossy manner. Stop teasing me, I jovially grumbled. It's bad enough having to wear this. Now the sun's out, I'd have thought it would be nice wearing that. Mum said. It's a lot more airy than your shorts and sweatshirt, she added, glancing at them on the rocks. Mum did tell me I'd probably be too warm when I chose my sweatshirt instead of a t-shirt, but it was cloudy then. A t-shirt would probably dry out faster too, but I guess it'd still stink of stagnant mud from the pool I'd tumbled into. It did feel kind of nice having the sun beat down on my bare shoulders and the breeze take the edge off its heat. I imagined if Sarah had brought her dress instead, the breeze would be whipping up inside it and I'd be battling to stop it blowing up and revealing my undies. I guess wearing a playsuit isn't so bad, even if it is a bit early. We clambered back down the rocks and tended to our sandcastle. We built a number of outer moats and a long deep channel to take advantage of the threatening tide. As we waited in anticipation for the tide to begin flooding our sandcastle, I noticed that Sarah kept looking at me strangely. I had a feeling I knew why but eventually had to ask. What? Nothing, she coyly replied. I was just thinking what you'd look like if I had brought my dress instead. I'd have looked like you, I replied. All pretty? Sarah grinned as she turned her head this way and that, as if posing for a photograph. No, I mean, I'd have worn your shorts and t-shirt, I replied. I think, I added as wearing a girl's pink t-shirt was also a long way from ideal. Is it nice wearing girls' clothes? She asked. It must be boring dressing like a boy all the time. But I am a boy, all the time, I countered. Yeah, but I don't dress like a girl all the time, she replied. Sometimes I like wearing boyish clothes and sometimes I like wearing girly clothes. She's right, I thought. My sister does seem to switch from tomboy to girly girl in the blink of an eye. I looked down at my playsuit and confessed, well, this isn't so bad, but I don't think I'd like to wear a dress. How do you know? Sarah replied. You didn't want to wear my playsuit at first. Yeah, but this is just a pair of shorts, I retorted. Kind of, I added as I looked down at myself. Do I look stupid? I asked. No, you look nice, Sarah told me. Which is why I was wondering if you'd look nice in a dress too. I felt myself begin to blush. I doubt it, I half-heartedly replied before noticing that the tide was about to flood our main gully. A few minutes later and the main moat we'd dug was beginning to fill. Look, Mum, I shouted. Very good, Mum shouted back, before advising us to come back up to where she was. Sarah and I clambered back up the rocks, me first with her following. I'm glad you're not wearing a dress, Peter, otherwise I'd be looking at your knickers right now, she said. Even if I was wearing a dress I wouldn't be wearing knickers, I replied as I scrambled up the last little bit. Oh yes you would, Mum said as I appeared. Nice frilly ones, she grinned. Oh Mum, I groaned. It's bad enough having Sarah going on about me wearing dresses without you starting. I think you'd look nice in a dress, Mum told me as she looked me up and down. You certainly look nice in a playsuit, she smiled as she looked past me to watch Sarah climb up the last bit of rock. I know, but that doesn't mean I want to start wearing dresses too. I know. Mum smiled. We're only teasing you, she said, taking hold on my hand to reassure me. But it's nice that you know you look nice, she added. Don't you think he'd look even nicer in a dress though? Sarah asked as she joined us. Of course. Mum replied. But it's up to Peter if he wants to wear one or not, she said. And I don't. I stated in no uncertain terms. We all spent the next half an hour watching the tide slowly destroy our sandcastle. Finally, the flag I'd mounted on the highest turret toppled and Mum suggested we walk further along the beach, into the dunes and eventually back to the car. She removed the rocks that had stopped my sweatshirt and shorts from blowing away to check if they were dry. These are still a bit damp, Peter, she said. They'll be okay to wear if you want. The idea of wearing damp clothes didn't sit well with me, plus it's still very warm under the sun. Now I'm okay, I replied. Mum asked if I was sure and I nodded, so she folded them up and put them in her beach bag. As usual, Sarah and I ran up and down the dunes whilst Mum trod the well-beaten path through them. It felt like any other day on summer day sands except for the fact I was wearing girls' clothes, and it was only when I stopped to think that became apparent. I imagined that wearing a dress would be far worse than wearing a playsuit. At least with this it's a pair of shorts on the bottom half and not a skirt, so there's no fear of me flashing my undies as I run and tumble. As we neared the car park on the edge of the dunes, Sarah and I scrambled up the last big incline and ran down it as fast as we could, wailing all the way. Mum watched us and smiled, but an old couple who picnicked next to their car were less than impressed. Will you tell those girls of yours to be a little quieter? The old woman hollered in our mother's direction. Sarah and I laughed and ran to the car, leaving Mum to either deal with them or ignore them. We were too out of breath to speak, so we just panted as Mum approached, rooting the keys from her handbag. I think that woman thought I was a girl, I said. I think they both did, Mum replied. Not surprising really, as you do look quite girly even if you do have short hair, she said as she pushed her fingers through it. I felt myself blushing again. I suppose it's better that than being recognized as an 11-year-old boy who's wearing a girl's playsuit. Sarah and I got in the back of the car and fastened our seat belts. Being used to much longer shorts, it was strange sitting with so little on to cover me or shield me from the rough fabric of the upholstery. Peter, my sister asked. What? I replied. Please Cece, will you try one of my dresses on when we get home? She asked in the most creepy crawly persuasive tone. It won't be really girly, she added. I sighed. Okay then, I replied. But please don't tell anyone, I insisted. It'll be our little secret, Mum said as she smiled at me via the rear view mirror. I forced a smile back and wondered what I'd got myself into.